First soul and second soul, and evermore soul, he said. It was a moment in the middle of the 19th century, the 1830s to be exact, not far from here. This man, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who started his professional life as a Unitarian minister and then left the parish ministry, went on to have a profound influence on what we broadly call spirituality. He and his other friends, who called themselves the Transcendentalist Club, believed that one must first pursue first-hand experience of the holy before any church or religious doctrine could properly give it to you, which it never could. We must acquaint ourselves at first hand with the deity, he said to a group of graduating seminarians at Harvard Divinity School in 1838, thus earning himself a position on their blacklist that would last for several decades. Leaders of the institutional church, you see, don't usually much like it when one of their own says that it's just as well to do without the church. To this day, we're laying some blame at Emerson's feet for the fact that so many people say, "Thank you very much, I go to church by walking in the woods or golfing." But that was what he said, not the golfing part, and taught and preached and lived. Ironically, I would say, because Emerson did continue to say these things from pulpits. He was a supply preacher long after he resigned his position as associate minister at what we now call First Church in Boston. It is quite likely he preached at the Unitarian Church in Lynn. It was Mr. Emerson's writing that led me back into the church when I was in my 20s, so I won't quibble with him. Although next week we will talk more about the legacy of Emersonian individualism and how it can undermine the shared vision of a covenanted community. Today, though, let's talk about the soul. Churches may fail in many ways and be sadly irrelevant in some ways, but one thing that we do very well in religious communities is to face the prospect of death together, our own, I mean, and deal with mortality together when death touches our communities. Here, continuing an ancient heritage, we ponder what is eternal about us, and we conclude that although we cannot know for sure, some religions, of course, conclude that they do know for sure, but we don't, we often take comfort in the fact that it so deeply matters that we have lived. I was always a very spiritual and mystical type kid and used to talk about the meaning of life and what happens before birth and after death fairly often with my father and with my best friend Melissa on many of our sleepovers. We talked about boys, yeah, we talked about the afterlife too. We were like little mini existentialists. Still are, but not so many. My quest for understanding took on a more urgent dimension after my father died suddenly when I was a teenager. And in my grief, I turned to the teachings of many world religions, looking there for answers, some monotheistic world religions, some non-theistic, and yet others with many gods. And I was intrigued especially by the idea of ancestors. Like many of you have, I eventually cobbled together a personal sense of the eternal and of the spirit and what I believe happens after death. But more than any answers, I found it and still find it meaningful to talk about these ideas with other people, not because we can never fully know the answers, but because talking together about the meaning of life and honoring what is real, even if we cannot see or prove that thing, is something that helps me trust my own experiences of the soul. In 1993, I was a high school English teacher and was encouraged to apply for a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which pays teachers, or at the time did, a beautiful sum of money to enter into intensive study for 4, 5, or 6 weeks, intensive study on a single subject. The scholarships were highly competitive, and teachers were only allowed to apply for one among, I think, about 50. I chose to apply for a seminar in Corvallis, Oregon, to study Emerson, Thoreau, and the Transcendentalists. Not because I had any particular interest in them, to be honest, but because I felt compelled by some strange force to do so, and I will explain how weirdly that happened to anybody who wants to know, at coffee hour or at our class on Wednesday. And I was encouraged to apply, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but it's true, by the fact that I thought this particular subject matter was so boring, and the location in Oregon so remote, I thought my chances at getting chosen were better. And I wanted to get out of town. I was living in Minnesota. My relationship with my longtime boyfriend was falling apart. I was being called to ministry and struggling with that, and I was upset and lost. That is how I discovered Emerson. During a month of intensive study at Oregon State University with Professor David Robinson. This is also where I was led to the next phase in my life, which was to go to Harvard Divinity School. It was David Robinson who first recommended that to me. I didn't know Harvard still had a divinity school. I thought, that sounds like something that happened hundreds of years ago. I still have the $1 Dover edition of Emerson's essays that I purchased there at the Oregon State University campus, and this is what it looks like from back when I first started reading this particular essay, The Oversoul. When I found this essay, I thought, oh my God, I don't ever have to write anything about my own theology because he's done it so perfectly for me. This is it right here. All marked up. I can't let go of it. I want to highlight some of the points that Mr. Emerson makes in this particular essay that resonated so powerfully for me. I am just one of millions and millions of people from all over the world, across more than a century and a half, who have embraced Emerson's ideas, who exulted upon finding his writings that spoke so truly for what had been within me just a felt sense, nothing much more clearly articulated than that. We could say that Waldo, and that's how he preferred to be known, was the first spiritual writer in America, strongly informed by his Christian upbringing, particularly influenced by a strongly Calvinist aunt, Mary Moody Emerson, influenced, of course, by the Unitarian ideas in which his ministry was formed, and in conversation with Greek philosophers, French revolutionaries, the natural setting he lived with in Concord, Mass. So these were some of the aha moments for me in this essay, The Oversoul, which to me is just a small taste of the banquet which Mr. Emerson left us after a long life of prolific writing and lecturing. He says that the soul isn't a subject that should just concern us in terms of an afterlife. This was the most important thing for me. The soul is something that concerns us now, when we are alive, every day, in every moment. We have a choice to live meanly, as he puts it, or to live deeply, to be truly present, to be truly attentive to the miracle in which we live and move and have our being. We know, he says, all of us know the difference between those two states because we are all possessed of a soul. It is that energy that animates us and whose origin is beyond us, making itself known through us. So our spiritual yearnings, our discontent, that sense that we often have of, God, there's got to be something more than all this running around. That sense that actually brings many of us to churches and to spiritual communities. It comes as what Emerson calls a fine innuendo by which the soul makes its enormous claim. The thing that will give us integrity and wholeness then is to arrange our lives, and this is a spiritual discipline, to arrange our lives moment to moment so that we can be obedient to that claim that the soul makes, to be attentive to the soul whose vehicle we uniquely are. The soul's origin is God, says Emerson, but not the traditional God of doctrines and rules. You can see where he earned himself enemies in the religious establishment. He wrote, "When we have broken our God of tradition," and notice, not broken from, when we have broken our God of tradition and ceased from our God of rhetoric. And here, by the way, he's using a small g for God. Very offensive to traditionalists, right? Then may God fire the heart with his presence. So, of course, he's a man of his time, so he's going to use a gendered pronoun. But let me say that again. When we have broken our God of tradition and ceased from our God of rhetoric, then may God fire the heart with God's presence. So he's taking the idea of the soul out of any specific religious doctrine or theological tradition even, and saying that it is universal, that we recognize it in moments of insight, in reveries, in daydreams, in night dreams, in revelations. And when we are with other people, we recognize it when we are speaking in utmost honesty and truth. That is its own kind of revelation of the soul. What Emerson does that is so beautiful to me is that he keeps affirming throughout this essay that every one of us knows when the soul is speaking. We know when the soul is working through us. In one of his most famous phrases, he says that we're not ever going to really know exactly how, in the scientific sense of the word, or whence comes the soul. We are not ever going to know, where does it come from? What's it made of? And he gently chides those who keep knocking at that door by saying, we must pick no locks. We must check this low curiosity. I love that. It's a mystery, you see, and it's a blessing, but it's a universal human legacy that we're born with. And I have used that line and this one with a lot of people who badger me about my belief in the soul and my religious spiritual faith. This is also Emerson. Do not require a description of the countries towards which you sail. And again, that's not just the afterlife, that's the here life. We are sailing toward countries of the soul. There's always this movement. But really, this isn't about a requirement that anyone believe in God, but that they believe in their own soul and participate in it, that eternity that comes through us all, that is the common element of all living things. When we live in the soul, we are one, because the soul is one. We are not separate. And we no longer harbor those illusions, those painful illusions that we struggle alone. How healing a notion that was to me when I first read it, and still is. It is not spirituality that harms, but the illusions of the ego, Emerson teaches us. And so in order to generate that genius that longs to make itself manifest through each of us in every moment, we must clear away the noise of the ego so that we can know when the soul is speaking. And that, again, as I said, is spiritual discipline. Emerson says, we know truth when we see it. Let skeptic and scoffer say what they choose. And when we are obedient to the soul, everything comes together in us. There is wholeness, peace, joyfulness, and integrity. We are sure, in Emerson's words, that our welfare is dear to the heart of being. and we connect with the things that we need for our continued growth and wisdom. That word obedience may throw you. Unitarian Universalists don't much love that word, obedience, in my experience. But you see, Emerson sets up the soul as the polar opposite of the ego, and is telling us what I sincerely believe we all do know deep down, which is that when we put ourselves, the little I, at the center of things, we really experience nothing but misery. Why am I not getting what I want? Why am I not living as I should? Why does this relationship not work for me? We get lost in all of those questions. The ego is simply too small and limited to be the driver of our existence. Its concerns are always petty, always self-referential, and often competitive. We basically set our egos up in such a way that they block the movement of the soul through us. So the obedience to which we are ultimately called is actually liberating. It's not, what's that word? Repressive. It liberates. It frees us. Emerson says every moment when the individual feels himself invaded by it is memorable. He's talking about that movement of the soul. And here, invaded is not meant to sound violent, but intimate, completely filled with the light that has its origins in the divine unknown, but that flows through us and illuminates all. I want you to check something in your order or in your hymnal right now. And just that first page, if you have a great hymnal, you've probably heard about the 7 principles, right? I'm looking at this very first page. You've heard about the 7 principles, but notice that right below the 7 principles, it says the living tradition we share draws from many sources. And look at that first one. It reads, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. The soul, my friends, that's what it's talking about. And you can thank Mr. Emerson for that first source that is directly from our transcendentalist heritage. Direct experience, unmediated experience of that divine movement of the soul through us is a legitimate source of religious faith. Jove nods to Jove from behind each of us, he wrote. And when we recite the covenant affirmation every Sunday as we light our chalice, and we say, as our Universalist forebears preached against the doctrine of depravity and hell of their day, which wasn't much before Mr. Emerson's, that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine, we can remember with a nod of debt and thanks to Mr. Emerson that growth is something that happens here and now, in this lifetime, not just when it is over and we are translated to eternity. Thank you, Mr. Emerson.